The college werewolf cheerleader rejected every jock but sat with the nerd. The silence in the lecture hall was heavy enough to crush a starship hull when Lola ignored the empty seat beside the team captain and moved with the predatory grace of her ancestors gliding up the stairs, while 300 students held their breath in collective confusion. Alec did not look up from his complex engineering schematics until a shadow fell over his work, and the scent of wildflowers and static electricity filled his personal space. She dropped her bag and slammed her heavy tail against the chair to claim the territory before looking him in the eye with a challenge that terrified the entire room. She did not ask for permission to enter his world. She simply decided that his world was the only one she wanted to inhabit right now. It was a moment that defied the gravitational pull of Hellion campus social politics, where the unspoken laws of caste and popularity were usually as rigid as the Durasteel girders holding up the orbital platforms. The grand lecture hall of Hellion campus was designed to intimidate with its vaulted ceilings of transparent polymer that looked out into the swirling amber clouds of the local nebula, and the tiered seating that rose like a cliff face of judgment and academic rigor. This was a university world dedicated to the pursuit of excellence in every conceivable field, where the atmosphere vibrated with the stress of 50,000 students constantly competing for rank and future commissions in the galactic fleet. The air inside the hall was recycled and scrubbed, but it always carried the faint metallic tang of nervous sweat and overheated processors, especially during midterm review week for advanced kinematics. Professor Vox, a crustacean-like entity with a voice that sounded like gravel grinding in a mixer, stood at the podium manipulating holographic equations that floated in the air like glowing ghosts of mathematics, waiting to haunt the unprepared. Usually the hierarchy of the room was as predictable as the tides with the varsity athletes, and the student council elite occupying the front rows where the lighting was best, and the attention was constant. They were the golden children of Hellion sprawling in their seats, with the casual arrogance of those who know their mistakes will be overlooked, because their physical stats bring glory to the alumni board. Among them sat Kale, the star quarterback of the Gravball team, a massive reptilian humanoid with scales that shimmered like polished obsidian, and a smile that had been engineered to sell protein supplements across 3 sectors. He had saved the seat next to him with a proprietary air, draping his varsity jacket over the backrest as a signal that this territory was reserved for the queen of the campus social scene. Everyone knew that Lola was supposed to sit there because that was how the narrative of their lives was written by the collective expectations of the student body. Lola was a Felonid variant, a species known for their lethal agility and their striking golden fur that seemed to capture and amplify the ambient light. She was the captain of the cheer squad, but to reduce her to that title was to ignore the terrifying physical power coiled beneath her uniform. Her amber eyes could spot a microfracture in a formation from across the field, and her claws could shred synthetic weave like wet paper if she ever lost her temper. She walked into the lecture hall with her high ponytail swaying like a pendulum of authority, and every head turned to watch her descent toward the front row, where Kale was already preening and checking his reflection in the blank screen of his datapad. But then the unthinkable happened. Lola paused at the bottom of the stairs and looked at Kale not with longing or affection, but with a sudden profound exhaustion that rippled through her posture for a fraction of a second before she steeled herself. She did not turn left toward the elite section. Instead, she turned right and began to climb the steep stairs toward the upper tiers where the lighting was dimmer, and the students were less concerned with posture and more concerned with passing. The sound of her boots on the metallic steps echoed like a rhythmic countdown to a social disaster. Kale's smile faltered and then froze into a rictus of confusion as he watched the golden fur of her shoulders moving away from him. The silence that descended was total and absolute as students nudged each other and deactivated their privacy screens to witness the disruption of the natural order. Lola kept climbing past the mid-tier students who scrambled to pull their bags out of her way, and past the slackers in the back rows, until she reached the very top corner of the hall. Alec sat in the shadow of a structural pillar, a human male of average height, and build wrapped in a baggy gray hoodie that had seen better cycles, and wearing glasses with a hairline crack in the left lens. He was invisible to the campus at large, a phantom who drifted between the library and the engineering workshops without making a ripple in the social fabric. Humans were considered a solid, unremarkable species on Hellion, known for their adaptability, but rarely celebrated for exceptionalism in a galaxy full of titans and telepaths. Alec liked it that way because invisibility meant he could work without interruption. He was currently engrossed in a holographic simulation of a propulsion drive modification, manipulating the wireframe model with precise gestures of his fingers, while a stream of data scrolled across his retina display. He was not asleep or slacking. He was running a compression algorithm in his head that was more advanced than anything Professor Vox was scribbling on the main board. When Lola arrived at his row, she did not hesitate. She saw the empty seat next to him, the one usually filled with spare parts and discarded energy drink canisters, and she cleared it with a sweep of her arm. Alec barely registered the movement until the heavy thud of her tail hitting the seat jolted him out of his calculations. He looked up, blinking behind his glasses, as the golden blur resolved into the most recognizable face on campus. The scent of her was overwhelming, a mix of expensive floral shampoo and the sharp ozone tang of a predator in peak condition. She dropped her heavy gear bag onto the floor with a metallic clang and sat down the servos in the chair, groaning slightly under the sudden shift in weight distribution. Alec stared at her, his hand frozen in midair where he had been rotating a virtual turbine. Lola turned her head and looked at him, her amber eyes narrowing slightly, as she assessed his reaction, waiting for the fawn-like panic she usually inspired in the non-combatant students. But Alec did not panic. He looked at her with a mild curiosity that bordered on indifference, his mind still half-tethered to the propulsion problem he was solving. He adjusted his glasses, pushing them up the bridge of his nose, and glanced at the row of stunned faces staring up at them from the tiers below. Then he looked back at Lola and raised a single eyebrow in a silent question that was far louder than any verbal interrogation. He did not shrink away, and he did not lean in. He simply existed in his own space with a gravity that surprised her. Lola leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand and twitching her ear toward the front of the room where Professor Vox was trying to regain control of the class. She spoke in a low voice that carried a purr of amusement. She asked him if he was going to keep staring, or if he was going to tell her why his simulation had a 20% efficiency loss in the thermal exhaust port. Alec blinked again, surprised that she had even looked at his screen, let alone analyzed the schematic in the 3 seconds she had been standing there. He cleared his throat and tapped the interface, turning the model so she could see the internal baffling. He whispered back that it wasn't a loss, it was a deliberate shunt to prevent the core from overheating during atmospheric entry, which she would know if she accounted for the friction coefficient of a Class M atmosphere. Lola smiled, and it was not her practiced cheerleader smile, but a sharp showing of teeth that felt dangerous and genuine. She tapped a claw against his desk and whispered that his heat shunt was clever, but it would destabilize the gyroscopes if he didn't counterbalance the torque. Alec felt a spark of genuine surprise ignite in his chest, because nobody outside of the advanced engineering cohort ever noticed the torque issue. He looked at her with new eyes, seeing past the golden fur and the perfect makeup to the intelligence gleaming behind her predatory gaze. He tapped a few keys on his console, adjusting the parameters based on her suggestion, and watched the efficiency rating climb to 98%. He nodded to her, a small gesture of respect that meant more to Lola than 1,000 cheering fans. Down in the front row, Kale was vibrating with a suppressed rage that radiated off him in waves of heat. He turned in his seat, glaring up at the back corner with eyes that promised retribution. The other jocks were whispering aggressively, glancing between Kale and the human in the back row, cracking their knuckles and posturing. But Alec did not notice them. He was too busy explaining the nuances of the fuel injection timing to Lola, who was listening with an intensity that made the rest of the room fade into background noise. She leaned in closer to him, her shoulder brushing against his hoodie, and for the first time in years, she felt the knot of tension between her shoulder blades begin to loosen. Here in the back row, surrounded by shadows and the hum of cooling fans, she did not have to perform. She just had to think. Professor Vox finally snapped the tension by slamming a manipulator arm onto the podium and demanding attention for the review of orbital mechanics. The lecture resumed, but the energy in the room had fundamentally shifted. The students were distracted, constantly stealing glances at the strange tableau in the back row. Lola took notes on a sleek datapad, her handwriting sharp and angular, while Alec continued to multitask, listening to the lecture while refining his project. Occasionally, they would exchange a look or a brief whisper, critiquing the professor's outdated methods or sharing a private observation about the physics of the problem on the board. It was an easy camaraderie that shouldn't have existed between a campus queen and a ghost, but it felt as natural as breathing. As the lecture wore on, Lola found herself watching Alec's hands. They were not the massive clawed hands of the athletes she dated, nor were they the manicured hands of the student politicians. They were stained with ink and grease, with calluses on the fingertips from typing and soldering. They were capable hands that built things and fixed things rather than just taking things. She noticed the way he paused before he spoke, thinking through his words to ensure accuracy rather than just filling the air with noise. It was a quality she hadn't realized she was starving for until this very moment. She realized that she had spent her entire academic career surrounded by people who were loud but empty, while this human was silent but full of substance. The bell signaling the end of the period rang like a judgment knell, and the spell was broken. The room erupted into chaos as students packed their bags and surged toward the exits, but a group of 5 large varsity athletes led by Kale did not leave. They stood at the bottom of the stairs, blocking the main exit, their arms crossed and their eyes locked on the top row. The threat was unmistakable. They were waiting for Alec. Lola stiffened, her fur bristling along her arms and her tail lashing anxiously against the chair legs. She started to stand up, her instincts screaming at her to intercept the threat, to place herself between the pack and the perceived weak link. She was ready to descend and snarl them into submission, using her status as a shield. But Alec placed a hand gently on her arm, stopping her. His touch was warm and firm, but not aggressive. He shook his head slightly, his expression unreadable behind the cracked lens of his glasses. He packed his gear with methodical slowness, not rushing despite the wall of muscle waiting for him downstairs. He told her quietly that she didn't need to fight a battle that hadn't started yet, and that biology was not the only determinant of power in this room. He slung his bag over one shoulder and gestured for her to follow him, not toward the main stairs where the jocks were waiting, but toward a maintenance access panel in the back wall that most students didn't even know existed. Lola watched in amazement as he pulled a small multi-tool from his pocket and deftly bypassed the electronic lock on the panel in under 3 seconds. The panel slid open, revealing a service corridor that led directly to the engineering wing, bypassing the main lecture hall exit entirely. He looked back at her with a faint smirk, the first sign of humor he had shown, and told her that engineers always build backdoors because systems invariably fail. He stepped into the corridor and held the panel open for her, inviting her into the hidden veins of the university, where the polished facade gave way to the raw machinery that made everything work. Lola looked down at Kale and his goons, who were still posturing at the bottom of the stairs, oblivious to the fact that their prey had already outmaneuvered them. She felt a surge of triumph that had nothing to do with cheerleading. She grabbed her bag and slipped through the panel after Alec, the heavy Durasteel sliding shut behind them with a satisfying click that sealed them in a private world of conduit pipes and humming servers. The air in the corridor was cooler, smelling of ozone and oil, and for the first time all day Lola took a deep breath that reached the bottom of her lungs. She walked beside Alec, matching his stride, her tail swaying with a relaxed rhythm. They walked in silence for a moment, the only sound the hum of the campus power grid running through the cables on the walls. Then Lola asked him how he knew about the exhaust port efficiency on her first guest back in the lecture hall. Alec adjusted his glasses and glanced at her sideways. He admitted that he had seen her reading advanced theoretical physics journals in the library cafeteria, usually hidden inside a fashion magazine, so nobody would bother her. He said he figured someone who went to that much trouble to hide their brain probably knew a thing or two about thermodynamics. Lola stopped walking and stared at him, stunned that he had seen her, really seen her, long before she had ever sat down next to him. Alec stopped too, turning to face her. He didn't offer a compliment or try to hit on her. He just stated it as a data point, a fact he had observed and filed away. He told her that the mask was good, but the books were better. Then he turned and continued walking toward the engineering labs, leaving Lola standing there with her heart hammering against her ribs in a way it never did during a game. She hurried to catch up to him, realizing that, for the first time in her life, she was the one doing the chasing, and she didn't mind it at all. The corridor opened up ahead of them, leading into the heart of the engineering sector, a chaotic, beautiful mess of machinery and invention, where status meant nothing and skill meant everything. Lola felt a grin spreading across her face, a real one this time, as she walked beside the nerd who had just outsmarted the entire football team without throwing a single punch. She realized that sitting with him wasn't just a deviation from the plan. It was the beginning of a much better one. The heavy Durasteel door of the maintenance tunnel slid shut behind them, and the sudden silence was not an emptiness but a presence. It was the hum of the university's deep infrastructure, the subterranean pulse of Hellion campus, that only the engineers and the janitorial drones ever truly heard. Alec did not stop to check if they were being followed, because he knew the encryption on that keypad was better than the security guarding the dean's private wine cellar. He moved with a familiarity that transformed his posture from the hunched, defensive stance of the lecture hall into a loose, confident stride. Lola walked a half-step behind him, her golden eyes adjusting instantly to the lower light levels of the service corridor. She felt a strange thrill running through her nervous system that had nothing to do with the adrenaline of the escape. It was the sensation of being brought backstage, of seeing the wires and the gears that moved the world she had spent her life performing on top of. They emerged 10 minutes later into the engineering sector, which was a sensory assault that Lola was entirely unprepared for. Unlike the pristine, sanitized levels of the upper campus, where the air was scented with synthetic lavender, and the floors were polished to a mirror shine, this place smelled of ozone-burnt flux and strong coffee. The air was hazy with the shimmer of containment fields, and the drone of heavy fabrication machinery vibrated through the deck plates and up into the soles of her boots. It was a cavernous space, a massive converted hangar bay, where hundreds of workstations were clustered like islands in a sea of cables and holographic displays. Students here did not wear the crisp uniforms of the academic elite or the armored jerseys of the athletes. They wore coveralls stained with coolant utility vests packed with tools and protective goggles that reflected the chaotic light of their creations. Nobody looked up as Lola walked in. Nobody cared that the queen of the cheer squad had descended into the mechanics pit, because in here status was determined by the efficiency of your code and the stability of your fusion containment. Alec led her through the maze of projects, stepping over a disassembled impulse drive and ducking under a floating drone chassis until they reached the far corner of the bay. His workspace was a fortress of solitude constructed from stacked server racks and scavenged bulkheads. It was cluttered in a way that suggested a mind, moving too fast to tidy up, with piles of data chips scattered like confetti and half-finished prototypes littering the workbench. But as Lola stepped inside, she saw the underlying order. The tools were arranged by frequency of use, the holographic interface was optimized for minimal hand movement, and the chair, a battered pilot seat salvaged from a decommissioned frigate, was positioned for maximum ergonomic support. Alec dropped his bag and slid into the chair in one fluid motion, his fingers flying across the haptic keyboard before he had even fully settled. The screens around him flared to life, washing the dim corner in a cool blue glow that reflected off the cracked lens of his glasses. Lola hovered at the edge of his sanctuary, suddenly feeling too large and too bright for this shadowed world of logic. She wrapped her arms around herself, her tail curling tight against her leg. She asked him what he was doing, expecting him to be hiding or checking the news feeds for fallout from their dramatic exit. Alec didn't look up. He told her he was ensuring that their exit remained permanent. He explained that Kale and his defensive line were currently trying to override the maintenance lock he had just engaged, but since they were using brute force algorithms instead of bypass keys, they were about to trigger a secondary security protocol he had written during his freshman year as a prank. He tapped a final key, and a small window opened on his main display, showing a grainy security feed of the corridor they had just left. Lola stepped closer, her curiosity overriding her hesitation. On the screen, Kale was slamming his shoulder against the maintenance panel, his face contorted in a roar that the audio dampeners reduced to a mute pantomime of rage. 3 other players were kicking the wall. Suddenly, the panel flashed a brilliant red, and a localized suppression foam system deployed from the ceiling. It was designed to extinguish chemical fires, but it worked equally well at immobilizing angry athletes. The foam exploded downward, covering the group in a rapidly hardening white sludge that glued them to the floor and to each other. Lola let out a sound that was half laugh and half gasp, covering her mouth with her hand. She watched Kale struggle against the hardening foam, slipping and sliding like a newborn foal, until he finally gave up and slumped against the wall, defeated by simple chemistry. Alec closed the window with a dismissive flick of his wrist. He told her that by the time the janitorial bots dissolved that foam, the lecture period would be over, and Kale would be too busy explaining to the custodial staff why he assaulted a fire safety system to bother coming down here. Then his fingers kept moving, dancing across a different interface. He said that he was also taking the liberty of remotely updating the locker room security protocols. He explained that the biometric scanners on the varsity lockers were notoriously glitchy, and he had just introduced a randomization algorithm that would require the athletes to solve a basic calculus problem to access their gear for the next 24 hours. He glanced up at Lola, a faint smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. He said he figured they could use the mental exercise since they clearly skipped the review session. Lola stared at him, her amber eyes wide. She had spent her life surrounded by males who solved problems with their fists or their wallets. The idea that someone could dismantle an enemy's entire day from a comfortable chair without ever raising his voice was a revelation that hit her with the force of a gravity well. She walked over to the spare stool on the other side of the workbench and sat down, her long legs cramping slightly in the tight space. She looked at the chaotic jumble of wires and crystals on the desk, and then back at his face. She told him that was the most ruthless thing she had ever seen, and she had watched linebackers break limbs for a scholarship. Alec shrugged, adjusting a microsolder on a circuit board. He said it wasn't ruthless, it was just efficient resource management. He said he didn't have the kinetic energy to fight a defensive line, so he used the network instead. Their moment of quiet victory was interrupted by a chime from Lola's datapad. She pulled it from her bag and frowned at the notification. It was a message from Professor Vox. The automated system had processed the attendance and the seating chart adjustments. Because she had been sitting in the engineering section during the midterm review, the algorithm had paired her with the student in the adjacent seat for the semester's capstone project. She looked at Alec, who was already reading the same notification on his main screen. They were partners. The assignment was bolded at the bottom of the message: design and simulate a sustainable habitation unit for a high-gravity Class 5 death world. Alec leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. He muttered that Vox was a sadist because Class 5 worlds had surface gravity distinct enough to crush a standard human skeleton in under an hour and atmospheric pressure that turned nitrogen into a narcotic. It was an engineering nightmare that usually required military-grade shielding and subterranean bunkers. He looked at Lola, assessing her not as a girl, but as a resource. He asked her if she knew the bone density requirements for a species native to a 3G environment. Lola didn't hesitate. She tapped her datapad, bringing up a biology schematic she had saved for her own training regimen. She told him that standard carbon fiber weaves wouldn't hold up against the sheer compressive force of a Class 5 gravity well. She explained that you needed a biomimetic lattice structure similar to the internal strutting in a felonid femur, but reinforced with titanium nanotechnology. She projected the image of her own skeletal structure onto the main display beside his architectural grid. Alec sat forward, his eyes locking onto the data. He didn't look at the image with lust, he looked at it with professional hunger. He overlaid her biological data with his structural supports and nodded slowly. He said that her instincts were correct, but if they used a rigid lattice, the wind shear on a Class 5 world would snap the habitat like a dry twig. He suggested a flexible outer shell, something that could breathe and shift with the atmospheric pressure like a lung or a muscle. He started sketching in the air, manipulating the light to form a dome that looked less like a building and more like a living organism. Lola watched his hands, fascinated by the way he translated biological reality into mathematical certainty. She stood up and moved around the desk, standing beside him so she could reach the interface. She reached into the hologram, her hand passing through the light as she grabbed a section of the virtual wall. She told him that if they made it flexible, they needed to anchor it deep. She explained that on her home world, the trees didn't just have roots, they had retractable grappling hooks that dug into the bedrock when the storms hit. She expanded the foundation of the design, driving the virtual pylons deep into the simulated crust. Alec watched her work, his eyes tracking the movement of her hands. He pointed out that deep anchors would hit the magma table on a young Class 5 planet, so they would need thermal exchangers to turn that heat into power. He wove a cooling system into her roots, turning the potential disaster into an energy source. They worked like that for hours, falling into a rhythm that was more intimate than any physical contact Lola had ever experienced. There was no posturing, no awkward small talk, just the pure, clean friction of two sharp minds sharpening each other. They spoke in a shorthand of coefficients and tensile strengths, finishing each other's equations and correcting each other's assumptions without ego. The workshop around them faded into a blurred background of noise and light, leaving only the glowing dome of their habitat and the intense focus of their collaboration. Lola took off her cheerleading jacket, revealing the black tactical undersuit she wore beneath it, and tied her hair back tighter. She was sweating slightly from the mental exertion and the heat of the equipment, but she felt energized in a way that tumbling routines never achieved. Alec paused at one point, reaching for a lukewarm bottle of nutrient paste and taking a long drink. He offered it to her without thinking, a casual gesture of sharing resources that surprised her. She took the bottle, wiping the rim, and drank. It tasted like chalk and vitamins, but she didn't complain. She handed it back and asked him why he stayed in the shadows. She gestured to the brilliant complex design floating between them, a structure that was elegant, robust, and revolutionary. She asked him why someone who could build this was content to be a ghost in the back of the room. She said that, with his mind, he could run the student council or captain the strategy team, but he chose to be invisible. Alec set the bottle down and looked at her through his cracked glasses. He was quiet for a long moment, the hum of the servers filling the silence. He told her that visibility was a trap. He said that the moment people saw you, they started expecting things from you. They wanted you to fix their comms or hack their grades or lead their projects. He said he liked the work, but he hated the performance. He looked at her pointedly, his gaze traveling from her high ponytail to the varsity patch on her discarded jacket. He said that he imagined she knew exactly what that felt like, to be valued for the show rather than the substance. He said he chose invisibility because it gave him the freedom to make mistakes and to build things that might fail without an audience jeering at him. Lola felt the truth of his words settle in her chest like a heavy stone. She turned away from him, slightly looking at the reflection of her face in a blank monitor. She admitted that she didn't know who she was when she wasn't performing. She told him that her species was bred for aesthetics and combat, and that everyone expected her to be a glorious trophy or a lethal weapon. She said that nobody ever asked her what she thought about hyperdrive mechanics or structural engineering. They just assumed that if she was beautiful and strong, she must be simple. She told him that sitting in the front row was exhausting because she had to hold her smile like a shield for 2 hours straight. Alec reached out and tapped the enter key on his keyboard, saving their work. The hologram flickered and solidified a testament to their shared effort. He turned his chair to face her fully, his knees bumping against hers. He looked up at her, capturing her gaze with a seriousness that made her breath catch. He told her that she wasn't simple. He said that the anchor system she designed for the habitat was the most complex piece of biomimicry he had seen all year. He told her that she didn't have to perform in here. He said that in this workshop, the only thing that mattered was whether the math worked, and her math was perfect. Lola looked at him, at the messy hair and the baggy hoodie and the quiet, steady hands. She realized that for the first time in her life she wasn't being looked at, she was being seen. The sensation was terrifying and addictive. She felt a purr rising in her throat, a deep instinctive rumble of contentment that she usually suppressed in public, because it was considered primal and unladylike. But here in the dim light, with the smell of ozone and the warmth of the machinery, she let it surface. It was a low vibration that filled the small space between them. Alec didn't flinch. He didn't laugh. He just smiled, that shy, crooked smile, and leaned back in his chair as if a terrifying apex predator purring at him was the most natural thing in the universe. He checked the time on his console and noted that the cafeteria would be closing soon. He asked her if she wanted to get real food or if she wanted to stay here and run the wind shear simulations on the habitat. He warned her that the simulations could take all night, and that he only had more nutrient paste and some stale crackers. Lola stood up, stretching her arms over her head and feeling her joints pop. She looked at the door to the main campus, where the lights were bright and the eyes were judging, and then she looked back at the hologram and the nerd who had locked a football team in a hallway for her. She sat back down, her tail curling around the leg of his chair with possessive finality. She told him to load the simulation. She said she liked stale crackers just fine, and she wasn't done proving that his structural load calculations were too conservative. As they settled back into the work, the atmosphere in the workshop shifted. It wasn't just a study session anymore. It was a partnership. The air was charged with a new kind of tension, not the hostile pressure of the lecture hall, but the electric potential of two compatible elements reacting. Lola watched Alec type, his face illuminated by the scrolling data, and she knew that she had crossed a line she could never uncross. She had stepped out of the spotlight and into the shadows, and she had found something there that shone brighter than any gold medal. She leaned in close, her shoulder pressing against his, and pointed at a line of code, challenging his logic just to see him smile when he defended it. The simulation began to run, the virtual wind howling against their shelter, but inside the design held firm, anchored deep, and built to survive the crushing weight of a heavy world. The transition from the focused quiet of the engineering workshop to the chaos of a planetary emergency began not with a siren, but with a sensation of absolute wrongness that vibrated through the soles of their boots. The simulation on the screen flickered and died as the main power grid spasmed, and for a terrifying heartbeat, the artificial gravity generators that kept Hellion Campus habitable momentarily lost their synchronization. Lola felt her stomach lurch into her throat as her weight dropped to near zero, lifting her heavy ponytail and the loose tools on the desk into a momentary suspension, before slamming back down with bruising force when the backup capacitors kicked in. The air pressure in the room dropped sharply, making her ears pop painfully, and the comfortable scent of machine oil was instantly replaced by the sharp metallic tang of fried circuitry and the sour smell of recycled air turning stagnant. The lights in the hangar bay died, only to be replaced by the strobing crimson of emergency warnings, rotating silently. Because the audio dampeners had shorted out, leaving the world in a terrifying muted state, where panic had to be felt rather than heard. Alec was moving before Lola had even fully registered the shift in gravity. He did not look at the ceiling or the flashing lights. He looked immediately at his console, where a cascade of red error messages was scrolling faster than the human eye should be able to track. He typed with a ferocity. She had never seen his fingers blurring across the mechanical keys of his custom board, bypassing the university's sanitized public alert system, to tap directly into the infrastructure diagnostics. Lola gripped the edge of the desk, her claws digging into the metal as she fought the instinct to crouch and cover. She watched Alec's face illuminated by the red glare of the screen and saw not fear, but a cold crystalline focus that was more reassuring than any fleet of rescue ships. He muttered to himself that the atmospheric stabilizers on the northern quadrant were desynchronizing, which meant the pressure dome over the stadium and the dormitories was about to fracture. He turned to her, and his voice was calm and low, cutting through the rising panic in her chest like a laser. He told her that the primary atmospheric scrubbers were failing, and the backup valves were jammed, because the administration had deferred maintenance on the mechanical linkages for 3 fiscal quarters. He stood up, grabbing his bag and shoving a heavy coil of copper wire and a terrifyingly large hydrospanner into it. He looked her in the eye and told her that if they didn't manually force the intake valves open within 20 minutes, the pressure differential would shatter the stadium dome like an eggshell. He didn't ask if she wanted to help. He simply stated the parameters of the mission and assumed she was capable enough to handle the variables. He told her he needed her leverage because the valves were rusted shut and his mass wasn't sufficient to torque them open against the vacuum seal. Lola grabbed her jacket, not bothering to put it on but wrapping it around her arm like a shield. She nodded once, her tail lashing with a mixture of anxiety and determination. They sprinted out of the workshop, not toward the safety bunkers where the rest of the engineering students were already heading, but toward the maintenance turbolifts that led up to the stadium level. The corridors were a nightmare of confusion. Students were running in every direction, clutching datapads and breathing, masks, their eyes wide with the primal terror of a species realizing their environment is no longer compatible with life. The air was already getting thin and hot, carrying the taste of dust from the hostile planetary surface outside the domes. Lola shouldered her way through a knot of panicked freshmen, clearing a path for Alec, who followed in her wake, checking the schematics on his wrist comp as he ran. When they burst out onto the main concourse near the stadium, the scale of the disaster became visible. The sky above the transparent dome, usually a serene projection of blue, was now a churning vortex of toxic orange clouds pressing against the invisible barrier. The force field was rippling under the assault, creating visible distortion waves that made the buildings look like they were melting. The stadium itself was packed with students who had been waiting for the pep rally, and now they were trapped inside a glass cage that was slowly failing. The exits were gridlocked, with terrified bodies crushing against each other in a desperate bid for freedom. And there, in the center of the chaos, stood the varsity team. Kale and the other heavy hitters were trying to force open the emergency blast doors, which had sealed automatically to contain the pressure loss. They were slamming their massive shoulders against the Durasteel, roaring with exertion, but the doors were designed to withstand orbital bombardment, and they wouldn't budge for muscle alone. Alec didn't even break stride. He shouted over the rising wind that the doors were magnetic locked and physical force was useless. He veered left, away from the screaming crowd, and toward a restricted service hatch concealed behind a holographic statue of the university founder. Lola followed him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked back at Kale, who was currently screaming at a terrified freshman, and felt a surge of disgust so potent it nearly made her dizzy. The stars of the campus, the heroes of the holofeeds, were useless when the script wasn't being followed. They were panic in uniform. Alec kicked the access panel to the statue, shattering the holographic projector and revealing the dark, rusted wheel of a manual airlock. He spun it with a grunt of effort, his sneakers squeaking on the polished floor and the hatch groaned open, revealing a vertical shaft that dropped into the darkness. He looked at Lola and told her that the intake valves were located on the exterior catwalks of the ventilation spire, which was currently exposed to the fluctuating gravity and the toxic winds leaking through the failing shields. He said it was going to be cold, it was going to be dangerous, and if they fell, nobody would ever find the bodies. He adjusted his glasses, pushing them up his nose with a smear of grease, and asked her if she trusted him. Lola looked into the dark pit, and then at the small human who was voluntarily walking into hell to save people who had never looked him in the eye. She didn't just trust him, she would have followed him into a black hole. She grabbed the ladder rung and swung herself into the shaft, her night vision activating instantly. She told him to lead the way and that she would catch him if he slipped. The climb was a brutal test of endurance that stripped away every layer of pretense Lola had ever worn. The shaft was narrow and vibrated with the dying shudders of the atmospheric engines. The air was freezing cold and smelled of sulfur and ancient dust. Alec climbed with a methodical efficiency, his movements precise and calculated, but Lola could hear his breathing growing ragged. He wasn't built for this kind of physical punishment. He was an engineer, not a soldier, but he never stopped. He kept climbing, pulling himself up rung by rung, driven by a will that was harder than the Durasteel walls. Lola climbed below him, keeping pace, her powerful muscles burning with the effort, but finding a strange rhythm in the shared struggle. She found herself reaching up to steady his foot when he slipped, or using her shoulder to brace a loose panel so he could pass. They were a single unit, a biological machine, moving with a singular purpose. They reached the access platform for the intake valves, and the reality of their situation hit them with the force of a physical blow. The platform was a narrow grating suspended over a drop that seemed to go down to the planet's core. The wind here was screaming a high-pitched shriek that tore at their clothes and froze the sweat on their skin. To their left, the massive intake valve loomed, a rusted behemoth of iron and gear teeth that hadn't been moved in decades. The control panel beside it was sparking, and dead, its interface fused by the power surge. Alec staggered onto the platform, bracing himself against the railing as the wind tried to tear him off the structure. He pulled the hydrospanner from his bag and shouted that they had to manually disengage the locking clamps before she could turn the wheel. Lola stepped onto the platform and planted her feet, her claws extending to dig into the metal grating for traction. She felt the raw power of the storm pressing against the failing force field just meters away. It was terrifying, but it was also clarifying. There were no social hierarchies here. There were no grades. There was only physics and the will to survive. Alec crawled toward the locking mechanism, shielding his face from the sparks showering down from the broken panel. He jammed the spanner into the gears and leaned his entire body weight against it, screaming with effort as he tried to leverage the rusted metal. The clamp groaned but didn't release. He slipped, his knuckles scraping raw against the iron, but he reset his grip instantly, ignoring the blood. Lola saw him struggling, saw the way his small frame was shaking with the exertion, and a feral protectiveness surged through her. She moved beside him, wrapping her large hands over his on the handle of the spanner. She shouted for him to guide it, and she would provide the force. He looked up at her, his eyes wild behind the cracked lenses, and nodded. On his count, they heaved together. Lola roared a sound that came from the depths of her predator ancestry, channeling every ounce of her strength into her arms and back. The metal screamed in protest, rust flacking off in clouds of red dust, and then with a concussive bang, the clamp shattered and released. The recoil threw them both back against the railing, but Alec scrambled up, instantly pointing to the main wheel. He shouted that the pressure was building and she had to turn the wheel now or the backlash would blow the seals. Lola lunged for the wheel, gripping the freezing metal spokes. It was immense, designed for industrial servos, not biological hands. She strained against it, her boots sliding on the icy grating. It wouldn't move. The pressure inside the valve was too great. She gritted her teeth, tears of frustration pricking her eyes. She was the strongest female on the squad, the apex of her class, and she couldn't move a stupid piece of iron. She felt panic rising, the fear of failure choking her. Then she felt a warmth at her back. Alec had wedged himself between her and the wall, bracing his back against the structure, and his feet against the wheel spokes, adding his leverage to hers. He wasn't strong, but he understood vectors. He told her to push at the 12 o'clock position while he pushed at the 6 o'clock position, maximizing the torque. He spoke into her ear, his voice calm and steady amidst the howling wind. He told her she could do this. He told her she was built for this. He told her to breathe and drive through her heels. His belief in her was a physical weight anchoring her against the storm. Lola closed her eyes, took a breath that filled her lungs with freezing air, and shoved. The wheel groaned. It moved an inch, then two. Then, with a grinding screech that vibrated through her bones, it began to turn. They pushed together, finding a rhythm in the agony, passing the spokes hand over hand. Steam hissed from the valve as the seal broke, sending a plume of white vapor into the air that obscured their vision. But they didn't stop. They kept turning until the indicator light on the manual gauge flickered from red to yellow and then to green. A massive shudder ran through the spire as the intake valves opened fully, and the fresh atmospheric pressure flooded the system, balancing the load and stabilizing the dome. The screaming wind outside dropped in pitch as the force fields realigned, and the orange clouds began to recede. Lola collapsed against the railing, her chest heaving, her arms trembling so hard she couldn't make a fist. Alec slid down the wall beside her, his hoodie torn and his face smeared with grease and blood. For a long moment they just sat there in the steam and the cold, listening to the machinery groan back to life. They were alive. The campus was safe. And nobody knew they were there. Lola turned her head to look at him. He looked like a wreck, his glasses askew and his hands shaking. But to her in that moment, he looked like a king. He pulled a rag from his pocket and wiped his bloody knuckles, wincing slightly. He looked at her and asked if she was okay, his first concern still for her well-being. Lola didn't answer with words. She reached out and took his hand, her large palm engulfing his stained fingers. She squeezed gently, careful of his injuries. She realized then that she had spent her life looking for a mate who could match her strength, but she had been defining strength all wrong. She thought strength was about lifting weights and dominating space, but strength was staying calm when the world was ending. Strength was climbing a freezing shaft to save people who ignored you. Strength was knowing exactly where to apply pressure to make the impossible move. Alec looked down at their joined hands and didn't pull away. He just rested his head back against the cold metal wall and let out a long, shaky breath. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a stark vulnerability. In the quiet of the maintenance platform suspended above the abyss, Lola felt a barrier inside her shatter. She realized that she could never go back to sitting in the front row pretending that Kale's touchdown stories were interesting. She had tasted real substance, and the flavor of it was addictive. She asked Alec how he knew the admin wouldn't send a team. Alec laughed, a dry sound that lacked bitterness. He said he knew because he read the budget reports and knew they spent the emergency maintenance fund on the new scoreboard. He said he knew because systems always fail where the money isn't looking. He turned his hand in hers, lacing his fingers through hers. He told her that was why you always had to know how to fix things yourself, because eventually the lights go out, and the heroes are just people with tools. They sat there for another 10 minutes, letting their heart rates normalize while the station automated systems came back online. The lights on the platform flickered and stabilized, casting a warm amber glow over them. Alec finally stood up, groaning as his stiff muscles protested. He offered his hand to help her up. Lola looked at it, and then at him. She stood up, towering over him again, but the dynamic had shifted completely. She didn't feel like she was looking down at him anymore. She felt like she was looking level at a giant. She brushed the rust dust from his shoulder, a gesture of intimacy that felt more significant than a kiss. She told him that they should probably go back before the dean realized someone had overridden the safety protocols. As they began the descent back down the ladder, the mood was lighter. The terror had forged a bond that was rapidly hardening into something unbreakable. Lola went first this time, carrying the heavy bag of tools so Alec wouldn't have to. When they reached the bottom of the shaft and stepped back out into the service corridor, the noise of the campus had changed. The panic was gone, replaced by the confused murmuring of thousands of students wondering why the sky had tried to kill them and then stopped. They emerged from the hidden panel near the engineering sector, sneaking out like culprits from a crime scene. They were covered in grime smelling of sweat and machine oil, and Lola knew she looked nothing like a cheer captain. Her ponytail was a mess, her uniform was snagged, and her face was streaked with grease. She caught her reflection in a darkened window and stopped. She expected to feel horror at her appearance. Instead, she felt a fierce pride. She looked like she had actually done something. She looked real. Alex stopped beside her, watching her look at herself. He didn't offer a platitude about how she still looked beautiful. He told her that grease was a badge of honor in his department. He said it meant you interacted with the universe instead of just observing it. Lola smiled at him, and it was the softest expression she had ever worn. She bumped her shoulder against his and told him that she might need to borrow some of his detergent because she didn't think floral shampoo was going to cut through hydraulic fluid. They walked back toward the dorms, avoiding the main thoroughfares where the crowds were gathering to speculate on the miracle. They walked in the shadows of the archways, staying close together. Lola realized that they were keeping a secret, not to hide their guilt, but to protect something precious. The rest of the campus could have their theories and their heroes. They could thank the administration or the gods or the varsity team. Lola knew the truth. She knew that the world was held together by a nerd with a wrench and the girl who was smart enough to hold the light for him. And as they reached the parting of ways, where the path split toward the athlete dorms and the engineering block, Lola didn't turn left. She kept walking beside Alec. She told him that she still had questions about the habitat design, specifically regarding the thermal exchange units. She asked if he had any more stale crackers because she suddenly found herself with an appetite for something dry and substantial. Alec smiled, pushing his glasses up his nose, and told her that he thought he might have a hidden stash of pretzels somewhere if she didn't mind them being a little crushed. The morning sun of Hellion Prime did not rise gently, but rather detonated over the horizon in a blinding flare of white light that washed out the neon glow of the engineering sector and turned the gray metal walls of the workshop into stark reliefs of industrial brutalism. Lola woke up with a stiff neck, and the taste of salt on her tongue curled into a ball on a pile of acoustic foam mats that Alec had dragged under the workbench for her. For a moment, in the haze between sleep and consciousness, she forgot where she was and reached out instinctively for the silk sheets of her dorm room, only to graze her knuckles against the cold casing of a server rack. The memory of the previous night rushed back to her, not as a dream, but as a series of sensory imprints. The freezing wind on the spire, the heat of Alec's back against hers, and the terrifying exhilaration of holding the lives of 50,000 students in her trembling hands. She sat up, stretching her spine until it cracked in 3 places, and looked around the lab. Alec was already awake, sitting in his pilot's chair, with a mug of coffee that smelled like rocket fuel, staring at the main view screen, with an expression that was colder than the vacuum of space. Lola stood up and moved to stand behind him, her hand resting naturally on the back of his chair as she looked at the screen. The university's official news feed was playing a loop of an interview recorded earlier that morning outside the stadium. Cale was standing there looking heroic and weary, with a carefully applied bandage on his forehead that covered absolutely no injury whatsoever. The caption beneath him read, "Savior of the stadium. Varsity captain holds the line against catastrophic failure." Cale was speaking into the microphone with a practiced humility that made Lola's stomach turn. He was explaining how he and his team had physically braced the blast doors to prevent the pressure leak, and how they had coordinated with the administration to reset the system. Then his expression darkened, and he mentioned that the failure was likely caused by an unauthorized intrusion into the engineering subnet by a rogue student project. He didn't name Alec directly, but he described a reckless underground experiment that matched the exact profile of the work Alec did. The narrative was being rewritten in real time, turning their heroism into a crime and Cale's incompetence into valor. Lola felt a growl start low in her chest, a vibration so deep it rattled the coffee in Alec's mug. Her claws extended, involuntarily slicing through the fabric of the acoustic foam she had been sleeping on. She hissed that he was lying, and that he was stealing their work while trying to frame Alec for the sabotage. She turned toward the door, her tail lashing with violent intent, ready to storm up to the administrative spire and tear the truth out of Cale's throat in front of the cameras. She was fully prepared to trade her scholarship and her social standing for the satisfaction of exposing him. The predator in her blood demanded justice, and on Hellion justice was usually dispensed with teeth. But Alec spun his chair around and caught her wrist. His grip was not strong enough to hold her physically, but the contact was shocking enough to make her pause. He looked up at her, and his eyes were not angry, they were calculating. He told her that if she went up there and attacked the star quarterback, she would be proving his point. He explained that Cale's narrative relied on the idea that the engineering students were dangerous, unstable elements who didn't respect authority. If she acted like a beast, she would give him exactly the footage he needed to bury them both. Alec released her wrist and stood up, smoothing down his rumpled hoodie. He said that they had been summoned to the dean's office 10 minutes ago. The charges were reckless endangerment of campus property and unauthorized access to life support systems. He picked up a small data drive from his desk and slipped it into his pocket. He told her that they were going to go up there, and they were going to dismantle Cale, not with claws but with the truth. The walk to the administration spire was a study in contrast. Lola marched with a lethal stiffness, her eyes fixed on the horizon, radiating a fury that made other students scramble out of her path. Alec walked beside her with a loose, relaxed gait, his hands in his pockets, seemingly unbothered by the fact that he was walking toward his potential expulsion. They entered the high-speed turbolift that shot them up to the pinnacle of the campus, where the air was thin and the floors were made of imported marble. The dean's office was a cavernous space dominated by a panoramic window that overlooked the entire university, a view designed to remind visitors of exactly how small they were. Dean Vex was a tall, slender humanoid with skin like parchment and eyes that had seen too many budget cycles to care about fairness. He sat behind a desk made of floating obsidian shards. Cale was already there, lounging in a chair to the right, flanked by the team coach and a representative from the Athletic Booster Club. When Lola and Alec entered the room, the atmosphere dropped 10 degrees. Cale looked at them with a smirk that was dripping with condescension. He greeted Lola with a fake concern, asking if she had been held hostage by the engineer all night, and implying that she was a victim of Alec's manipulation. Lola stepped forward, her lips pulling back to reveal her fangs, her voice trembling with the effort to not scream. She started to speak, to tell the dean that Cale was a liar and a coward, but Cale cut her off. He told the dean that it was tragic, really, how the engineering department's lack of discipline had nearly killed them all. He claimed that he had seen Alec tampering with the atmospheric regulators earlier that week, and that the fix last night was just Alec trying to cover his tracks after the system went critical. The coach nodded solemnly, adding that the varsity team had risked their lives to hold the doors shut while the nerd played God with the software. Dean Vex sighed, looking at Alec with a mixture of boredom and disappointment. He said that the logs showed an unauthorized manual override of the intake valves, a reckless action that violated safety protocols. He said that given the testimony of Mr. Cale and the severity of the incident, he had no choice but to recommend immediate expulsion for Alec and a disciplinary review for Lola for being an accomplice. He reached for his digital stylus to sign the order. The injustice of it was a physical weight in the room, a suffocating blanket of lies woven by power and privilege. Lola felt her vision narrow into a red tunnel. She didn't care about the cameras anymore. She didn't care about her future. She was going to leap across that obsidian desk and make Cale bleed. She shifted her weight onto her back leg, preparing to launch, her muscles coiling like high-tension springs. Alec stepped in front of her. He didn't raise his hands and he didn't shout. He simply stepped into her line of sight, breaking her fixation on Cale. He looked her in the eye for a split second, broadcasting a message of absolute calm, and then he turned to the dean. He asked quietly if the dean was interested in the metadata or if he preferred to make decisions based on fiction. Cale laughed a harsh barking sound and asked what metadata could possibly excuse breaking into a restricted area. Alec ignored him. He pulled the small data drive from his pocket and placed it on the edge of the dean's desk. He said that he had a habit of running a background diagnostic on any system he interacted with because he didn't trust university maintenance schedules. He said that the drive contained the complete sensory logs from the statue in the concourse, the pressure sensors from the blast doors, and the biometric readings from the maintenance shaft. The dean paused the stylus hovering over the expulsion order. He looked at the drive and then at Cale, who had suddenly stopped smirking. Alec continued, his voice steady and matter-of-fact, filling the silence of the room. He said that the logs would show that the atmospheric instability began at 400 hours, caused by a rusted valve linkage that had been flagged for repair 6 months ago. A repair request that was denied to fund the new holographic scoreboard for the stadium. He glanced at the booster club representative, who shifted uncomfortably. Alec then gestured to the main display on the wall. He asked for permission to play the audio file from the concourse at the moment of the crisis. The dean, intrigued by the sudden shift in power dynamics, nodded. Alec tapped the console and the room was filled with the sound of the wind screaming and the panicked shouts of the students. Then Cale's voice cut through, clear and unmistakable. He was screaming at a freshman, threatening to break his legs if he didn't move out of the way so Cale could get to the escape pods. The room went dead silent. The savior of the stadium hadn't been holding the line he had been trying to flee. Cale's face went a mottled shade of gray. Alec didn't stop there. He pulled up a holographic graph showing the pressure readings on the blast doors. He pointed out that the pressure differential was 5,000 pascals. He explained that even if the entire football team had pushed against those doors, they wouldn't have generated enough newtons of force to affect the seal by even 1%. He said that the idea of holding the door was physically impossible and mathematically illiterate. Finally, Alec brought up the security footage from the engineering corridor from Part 2. It showed Cale and his friends kicking the wall and then getting glued to the floor by the suppression foam. Alec looked at the dean and said that while he was busy climbing a ventilation shaft into a toxic storm to manually crank a valve that hadn't been greased since the last century, Mr. Cale was busy fighting a fire extinguisher and losing. He turned to look at Cale, who was now slumped in his chair, looking less like a hero and more like a child caught stealing. Alec said that he didn't care about credit and he didn't care about statues, but he refused to let incompetence be rewarded while competence was punished. He told the dean that if he expelled him, he would release this entire data package to the planetary news net within 5 minutes. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The dean looked at Cale with cold realization. The coach looked at the floor. Lola stood frozen behind Alec, her rage transmuted into a profound awe. She had seen battles won with speed and strength, but she had never seen a massacre committed with nothing but timestamps and audio files. Alec had dismantled Cale's entire existence without breaking a sweat. He had protected them not by fighting, but by being smarter, prepared, and utterly fearless in the face of authority. Dean Vex cleared his throat and deleted the expulsion order with a flick of his finger. He looked at Cale and said that perhaps the varsity team required a change in leadership and a remedial course in physics. He told the coach that the budget for the scoreboard was hereby reallocated to maintenance, effective immediately. Then he looked at Alec and Lola. He said that the university did not condone unauthorized repairs, but in light of the alternative, massive loss of life and a public relations nightmare, he was willing to overlook the infraction. He suggested they leave his office before he changed his mind. Lola didn't wait. She grabbed Alec's hand and pulled him out of the office, marching him back into the turbolift. The doors slid shut, sealing them in the quiet capsule as they plummeted back down toward the real world. Lola stared at the numbers counting down the floors, her chest heaving as the adrenaline crash hit her. She looked at Alec, who was leaning against the wall, cleaning his glasses on his hoodie, as if he hadn't just humiliated the most powerful clique on campus. She realized then that she had almost ruined everything. If she had attacked Kale, she would have been the villain. Alec had saved her from herself. He had known exactly what she was going to do, and he had stepped in to take the burden off her shoulders. She moved across the small space, crowding him against the wall. Alec looked up, blinking his eyes wide as the golden-furred giantess loomed over him. But she didn't strike. She placed her hands on the wall on either side of his head, caging him in but not with threat. She looked down at him, her amber eyes searching his face. She asked him why he did that. She asked why he stood in front of her when he knew she could have snapped Kale in half. Alec looked back at her, and for the first time he didn't look away or retreat into Data. He told her that he knew she could snap him in half, and that was exactly why he had to stop her. He said that Kale wasn't worth her future. He said that she had spent her whole life being the strong one, the one everyone looked at to perform, and he wanted her to know that she didn't have to fight every battle alone anymore. He said he wanted to protect her not because she was weak, but because she was precious. The word hung in the air between them, heavy and sweet. Precious. Nobody had ever called Lola precious. They called her hot. They called her strong. They called her a beast. But nobody had ever treated her like something that needed to be guarded. A shudder ran through her frame, and the last of her feral tension dissolved, leaving her feeling raw and exposed. She leaned her forehead against his, resting her weight on him. She whispered that she wanted to kill him. She admitted that the rage was so hot she couldn't see straight. Alec reached up and tentatively placed his hands on her waist, his thumbs brushing against the soft fur of her sides. He told her that it was okay to be angry. He said that anger was just energy, and she had a lot of it. He said that next time they would just channel it into something useful like torque or hydraulics. The lift arrived at the ground floor with a soft chime, but neither of them moved. The doors opened, revealing the bustling lobby, but Lola stayed where she was, shielding Alec from the world with her body. She realized that the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. In the lecture hall, she had been the predator and he had been the prey. In the shaft, they had been equals. But here in the aftermath, he was the alpha. Not because he was louder or stronger, but because he had the control. He governed the chaos. And for a creature like Lola, who was constantly at war with her own instincts, and the expectations of the world, surrendering control to someone she trusted was the ultimate relief. She pulled back slightly, looking at him with a new kind of hunger. It wasn't the predatory hunger of the cafeteria or the performative hunger of the cheer squad. It was a desire to be near him, to learn from him, to let his calm order settle her chaotic storms. She asked him what they were going to do now. Kale was disgraced, but the team would still be angry. The campus would be talking. Alec shrugged, slipping past her to step out into the lobby. He adjusted his bag on his shoulder and checked his wrist comp. He said that the news cycle on Hellion lasted about 6 hours before the students got distracted by something else. He said that in the meantime they still had a habitat simulation to finish, and he had an idea about using a non-Newtonian fluid for the outer shell to absorb impact shock. Lola laughed, a deep throaty sound that turned heads across the lobby. She followed him out, her tail swaying with a jaunty arrogance that was entirely different from her cheerleader strut. She caught up to him and bumped her hip against his, nearly knocking him into a decorative fern. She told him that non-Newtonian fluids were messy and unpredictable. Alec smiled up at her, that crooked secret smile that was only for her. He said that sometimes the messy, unpredictable things were the strongest. He took her hand again, openly, this time right in the middle of the main concourse. He didn't look around to see who was watching. He didn't care. And as Lola walked beside him, her golden hand engulfing his pale one, she realized that she didn't care either. The jocks could stare. The dean could posture. The world could spin. She had found her seat and she wasn't moving. They walked out of the administrative tower and into the sunlight of the quad. The air was fresh, scrubbed clean by the storm and the very systems they had fixed. Students were sitting on the grass, studying, laughing, oblivious to how close they had come to disaster. Lola looked at them, at the normal people living their normal lives, and felt a strange sense of distance. She and Alec were apart from them now. They shared a secret history, a trauma, and a triumph that bound them together in a gravity well of their own making. She squeezed his hand and he squeezed back 3 quick pulses of pressure. It was a code, a signal. It meant I'm here. I've got you. We are solid. As they headed back toward the engineering sector to hide away in the dark and build worlds that could survive anything, Lola felt a shift in her own soul. She was done performing. She was done being the trophy. She was done waiting for a prince who was just a frog in a jersey. She had found a king in a hoodie, and she was going to help him build a kingdom that no wind could ever blow down. She looked down at Alec and asked him if he thought they could incorporate a kinetic feedback loop into the habitat's foundation, something that got stronger the harder the world hit it. Alec looked at her, his eyes shining behind the cracked glass. He said that was exactly what he was thinking. He said that was the only way to build something that lasted forever. The finals of the Galactic Collegiate League arrived 3 weeks later, crashing into the atmosphere of Hellion Campus with the subtlety of an orbital bombardment. The stadium was a cauldron of noise and blinding light, a synthetic coliseum capable of seating 80,000 screaming fans from a dozen different star systems. The air inside the dome, the same dome that Alec and Lola had saved from catastrophic failure only 20 days prior, was thick with the scent of ozone, cheap concessions, and the pheromones of 50,000 nervous students. It was the biggest night of the year, the culmination of the social calendar, and the holy grail of the varsity elite. For Lola, it was usually the night she felt the most powerful, standing at the center of the field with the roar of the crowd washing over her like a physical tide. But tonight, as she stood on the sidelines amidst the squad of trembling freshmen and preening seniors, she felt a profound sense of detachment. The noise was just noise. The lights were just photons. The only reality that mattered was sitting quietly in a glass-walled box high above the 50-yard line, away from the sweat and the desperation of the crowd. She adjusted the straps of her uniform, the golden fur of her arms bristling slightly against the chill of the stadium's climate control. The squad captain, a vixen with more ambition than sense, was shouting last-minute instructions over the deafening bass of the hype music, but Lola wasn't listening. Her eyes were locked on the VIP tier, specifically on the box that usually belonged to the dean of admissions. Tonight, however, it was occupied by a single human male wearing a gray hoodie that looked suspiciously like it had been washed with industrial degreaser. Alec sat there with his legs crossed, comfortably reading a holographic schematic on his datapad, while 80,000 people screamed for blood and glory around him. He looked entirely out of place, and yet completely at home, like a calm singularity in the center of a chaotic universe. He had secured the box not through money or influence, but because Dean Vex had decided that the student who knew how to override the stadium's life support systems probably deserved a comfortable place to watch them function. It was a silent apology and a bribe to keep him happy, and Alec had accepted it with the same shrug he used for everything. The whistle blew, signaling the halftime show. This was Lola's domain. The music shifted to a heavy rhythmic pounding that mimicked the heartbeat of a predator. The squad surged onto the field, a wave of color and synchronized movement. Lola took the point position, her body moving on autopilot. She launched herself into a series of tumbling runs, her powerful legs driving her into the air with a grace that defied her mass. She spun, she caught the flyers, she roared at the crowd with a ferocity that usually terrified the opposing team. The crowd went wild, chanting her name, feeding on the spectacle of the Golden Beast woman dominating the arena. But as she landed her final dismount, her chest heaving and her claws digging into the synthetic turf, she didn't look at the cameras. She didn't blow a kiss to the student section. She looked up at the glass box. Alec had lowered his datapad. He was watching her. He wasn't cheering, he wasn't screaming, he was simply witnessing her. He pushed his glasses up his nose and gave her a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of recognition that cut through the adoration of the masses and hit her straight in the heart. The game resumed, but the narrative on the field had changed. Kale, the disgraced former captain, was playing second string, desperate to reclaim his glory. He was running plays with a frantic, sloppy energy, trying to force outcomes rather than reading the field. The crowd could smell the desperation on him. When the final buzzer sounded, and Hellion won by a narrow margin thanks to a lucky gravity well interference, the celebration was muted. The team rushed the field, piling onto each other in a performative display of camaraderie, but the hollowness was palpable. They looked toward the cheer squad, expecting the usual ritual, where the girls would run out and drape themselves over the victors, validating their status with beauty. Kale stood near the end zone, panting heavily, looking directly at Lola with eyes that pleaded for her to come back to the script. He needed her to stand next to him, to smile at him, to make him look like a winner again. Lola walked onto the field. She moved with a slow, deliberate stride, her tail swaying with a hypnotic rhythm. The cameras zoomed in, broadcasting her face to the massive screens floating above the dome. She walked past the defensive line, ignoring the outstretched hand of a linebacker. She walked past the new quarterback, who preened and flexed as she approached. She walked straight toward Kale. He straightened up, fixing his hair, forcing a smile that didn't reach his reptilian eyes. He opened his arms, ready to receive the absolution of the campus queen. The crowd held its breath, expecting the reconciliation, expecting the return to the status quo. Lola didn't stop. She didn't even slow down. She walked past Kale as if he were a piece of furniture, passing within inches of him without acknowledging his existence. The wind of her passing ruffled his jersey. She left him standing there with his arms open, embracing nothing but the empty air and his own irrelevance. A ripple of shock went through the stadium, starting in the front rows and spreading outward like a shockwave. Lola kept walking. She crossed the sideline, stepping over the white paint that demarcated the boundary between the players and the spectators. She walked to the base of the VIP stands where the security drones hovered. The drones scanned her, recognized her authorization code, which Alec had quietly added to the system 3 weeks ago, and parted to let her pass. She began to climb the stairs. It was a long ascent, mirroring that first day in the lecture hall, but this time the context was inverted. Then she had been climbing away from expectation into obscurity. Now she was climbing away from glory into reality. She walked up the concrete steps, her cleats clicking on the stone, oblivious to the 80,000 pairs of eyes watching her. She passed the alumni section where the wealthy donors sat. She passed the student council box where the politicians watched. She climbed until she reached the highest tier, the rarefied air of the VIP suites. She stopped in front of the door to box 414. She didn't knock. She swiped her palm against the reader and the door hissed open. The silence inside the box was instant and profound. The roar of the crowd was cut off by the thick acoustic glass, replaced by the gentle hum of the air recyclers and the soft beep of Alec's console. He was standing now, leaning against the glass wall, looking down at the field with his hands in the pockets of his hoodie. He turned as she entered. He didn't look surprised. He looked ready. Lola stood there for a moment, catching her breath, filling the small space with her presence. She was sweaty, her hair was a mess, and she was wearing a uniform that represented a life she had just walked away from. She felt more beautiful than she ever had in her life. She walked over to him and sat down on the plush leather couch that faced the field. She patted the seat beside her. Alec sat. He didn't try to take up space. He didn't try to dominate the moment. He just sat close enough that their arms touched, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of solder and soap that was uniquely him. She leaned her head back against the cushion, closing her eyes and letting out a long, shuddering breath. She asked him if he saw Kale's face. Her voice was raspy, deep, with the exhaustion of the performance. Alec chuckled, a low sound that vibrated against her shoulder. He said he saw the statistical probability of Kale's ego collapsing in real time, and it was a beautiful data point. They sat there for a long time, watching the stadium empty out. The janitorial bots came out to sweep the confetti, and the fans filed toward the exits, their cheers fading into the night. Lola opened her eyes and looked at the empty field. She told Alec that she was done. She said she wasn't going back to the squad next semester. She said she was tired of being a decoration. Alec nodded as if this was a logical conclusion to a mathematical proof. He asked her what she wanted to do instead. He didn't suggest she join him, he didn't push his own agenda, he just created the space for her to choose. Lola turned to look at him. She reached out and took his hand, playing with his fingers, marveling at how fragile they looked compared to hers, and yet how much power they held. She told him that she had been thinking about that kinetic feedback loop they discussed. She said she had an idea for applying it to exoskeleton joints for heavy world laborers. She explained that if they used a non-Newtonian fluid buffer in the knee joints, the suit would get stronger the more weight the worker carried, effectively canceling out the fatigue factor. She started sketching the design in the air with her finger, her eyes lighting up with the same intensity she used to reserve for stunts. Alec watched her listen with a focus that made the rest of the world disappear. He caught her hand, stopping her air drawing. He pulled a stylus from his pocket and handed it to her, then offered his own arm as a canvas. He told her to show him. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing pale skin mapped with the faint scars of soldering burns. Lola hesitated for a fraction of a second, then she uncapped the stylus and began to draw the schematic directly on his skin. The ink flowed black against his forearm, mapping out the hydraulics and the pressure sensors. They sat there in the VIP box high above the empty arena, engrossed in the intimate act of creation. The world outside was dark, but inside the box the future was being written one line of ink at a time. The story of the cheerleader and the nerd didn't end with a kiss in the rain or a public declaration of love. It ended with graduation day 6 months later. The ceremony was held in the same stadium, but this time Lola and Alec walked across the stage together. They didn't walk with their respective cliques. They walked side by side, a striking visual anomaly that defied every algorithm of campus compatibility. Lola wore her gown with the sleeves ripped off to accommodate her biceps, her golden fur shining in the sun. Alec wore his gown over his hoodie, his cracked glasses finally replaced by a sleek pair of tactical spectacles that Lola had designed for him. When their names were called, Alec the valedictorian of engineering and Lola the salutatorian of biomechanics, the applause was polite but confused. The student body still didn't quite understand what they were looking at. They saw a beauty and a beast, but they couldn't figure out which was which. They didn't attend the graduation parties. Instead, they took the first transport shuttle off-world, heading for the industrial sector of Hellion Prime, where real estate was cheap and zoning laws were loose. They used the prize money from a design competition they had won for a revolutionary portable shelter based on their midterm project, to put a down payment on a derelict warehouse. It was a dusty, echoing space filled with rusted girders and shadows, but to them it looked like a palace. They hung a sign out front painted by hand because they didn't want to wait for a fabricator. It read, "Helix and Hyde, Adaptive Ergonomics and Kinetic Systems." The business started small. They took contracts that the big firms ignored, fixing life support systems for mining colonies and designing custom prosthetics for veterans with non-standard physiologies. But their reputation grew with the speed of a viral code. Clients began to whisper about the strange pair running the shop in Sector 7. They said that if you had a problem that brute force couldn't solve and delicate math couldn't handle, you went to Helix and Hyde. They said the human would analyze the problem until it begged for mercy, and the beast woman would build the solution with hands that could crush stone but handle microchips like butterfly wings. One evening a year after graduation, they were working late in the warehouse. The massive bay doors were open to the violet twilight of the industrial district. The air was filled with the hum of their fabricators and the smell of ozone and coffee, the scent of their shared life. Lola was under the chassis of a heavy loader, utilizing her immense strength to hold a hydraulic piston in place, while Alec lay on a creeper underneath it, wiring the control sensors. They were communicating in their usual shorthand, a language of grunts, numbers, and technical jargon that was more romantic to them than poetry. Alec slid out from under the machine, wiping grease from his forehead. He looked up at Lola, who was holding the 500-pound component as if it were a pillow. He told her that the sensor array was green and she could lock it down. Lola engaged the magnetic clamps and released the weight, dusting her hands on her coveralls. She looked down at him lying on the floor, surrounded by tools, his hair a mess, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a job well done. She felt a surge of affection so strong it nearly brought her to her knees. She reached down and scooped him up, lifting him off the ground as easily as he had lifted the stylus. She held him at eye level, her feet dangling a few inches off the floor. She told him that they made a good team. It was an understatement, a simplified variable in a complex equation, but it was the absolute truth. Alex smiled, hanging comfortably in her grip, his hands resting on her massive shoulders. He told her that their compatibility rating was statistically improbable. He said that by all accounts they should have destroyed each other. The popular girl should have crushed the nerd, and the nerd should have resented the popular girl. But they had rewritten the code. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers. He said that he preferred their version of the simulation. Lola lowered him slowly until his feet touched the concrete, but she didn't let go. She pulled him into a hug that enveloped him, completely shielding him from the drafty warehouse and the chaotic galaxy outside. She rested her chin on the top of his head, breathing in the scent of him. She realized that she had spent her youth chasing the noise, the applause, and the adrenaline of the game. But here in the quiet with the man who had seen her when she was invisible, she had found the signal. The jocks were gone. The cheers had faded. The trophies were gathering dust in a box somewhere, but the work remained. The partnership remained. They stood there for a long moment, two distinct silhouettes merged into one shadow against the dying light. The beast and the brain, the force and the vector. They had rejected the roles the universe had assigned them and built a new world in the empty space between expectations. And as the stars began to come out over the industrial skyline of Hellion Prime, twinkling through the smog and the steam, Lola knew one thing for certain. She had made the right choice when she climbed those stairs. She had rejected the easy path, the comfortable lie, and the empty seat. She had chosen the hard work, the heavy lifting, and the nerd. And looking around at the empire of dirt and steel they were building together, she knew she would make the same choice 1,000 times over. She pulled back slightly, looking into his eyes. She asked him if he was ready to test the prototype for the kinetic dampeners. Alec grinned, pulling a remote control from his pocket. He said he was born ready. He pushed the button, and the heavy loader hummed to life, its engine purring with a perfect synchronized rhythm. Lola smiled, her tail curling around Alec's leg, grounding him, anchoring him, claiming him. They turned together to face the machine, ready to break it down and build it better, just like they had done with everything else. The game was over. The work had just begun, and it was going to be glorious.